A few nights before he died, Edgar Allan Poe was found wandering the streets in a fugue state. Disturbingly, he was wearing someone else's clothes, and as he was dying, he kept shouting one word. Edgar Allan Poe makes most tragic artists look well-adjusted by comparison. The master of the macabre lived a life filled with scandal, tragedy, and addiction, yet somehow, his mysterious death topped it all. Before he was Edgar Allan Poe, he was just Edgar Poe, the second child of two actors born in Boston, Massachusetts. Had things gone according to plan, maybe younger Edgar would have followed them into a life on the stage, but it wasn't meant to be. No surprises here. The infamously dark and dreary writer's life got off to a dark and dreary start. There's a very good chance that Poe got his name from the character in Shakespeare's King Lear, which his parents were performing at the time of his birth. If that's the case, then it's fitting, because Edgar Allan Poe's life story was definitely a tragedy. Just a year after Poe's birth, his father abandoned their family. Then a year after that, consumption claimed his mother. If you're hoping that his father stepped up and returned to support his orphan children, you're in for a disappointment. No one knows exactly what happened to him, but Poe's father died the same year his mother did. Little Edgar Poe and his older brother were left totally alone in the world, but Poe got help from a completely unexpected source. Taking pity on the young boy, a wealthy merchant named John Allan took Edgar into his home in Richmond, Virginia. Allan gave Poe a place to live, a family like he'd never known, and a name. But while John Allan took the young boy in, this was no paradise. Life in the Allan home could be incredibly difficult. Edgar Allan Poe had an extremely strange relationship with his foster father. While Allan could sometimes completely spoil Poe, he had a darker side as well. Whenever Poe stepped out of line, Allan's discipline was swift and brutal. Their mercurial relationship was undoubtedly stressful, though his later life would be marked by poverty, addiction, and mental illness. Edgar Allan Poe enjoyed a fairly charmed childhood. He moved to England with the Allans at 6 years old and got a fine education at expensive boarding schools across the country. Maybe, if the Allans had stayed in England, Poe would have been spared the life of suffering that lay ahead, but we'll never know. In 1820, the Allans set sail for America once more, totally unaware of what lay ahead of them. The Allans were already well off, but in 1825 they hit the jackpot. Like most rich people, John Allan had an even richer uncle, and when he died, he left his nephew a massive inheritance in both cash and real estate. John Allan's inheritance was the equivalent of $17 million today. That's a big chunk of change, and Allan celebrated the occasion the way most of us would. He bought a house, but not just any house. Allan bought a sprawling 2-story brick manor. Poe shortly after met the love of his life. Her name was Sarah Elmira Royster, and she lived next door. When Poe was 16 and Royster was 15, the two neighbors made their relationship something more. But sadly, their love was doomed from the start. Edgar Allan Poe had a charmed childhood, but he was still an orphan. That made him a totally unacceptable match for Sarah in her father's eyes. He made his feelings about Poe clear, but that didn't stop the two young lovers. They carried on their affair in secret, and even got engaged around 1826. But Royster's father would go to cruel lengths to make sure his daughter never married Poe. Shortly after Poe asked Royster to marry him, he enrolled at the University of Virginia. They separated, but Poe made sure to send love letters to his fiancée as often as possible. There was only one problem. Royster's father made sure she never saw a single one of them. He intercepted and destroyed every single letter that Poe sent. Heartbroken, Royster assumed that Poe had forgotten all about her. By the time Poe saw her next, she was already married to another man. Losing Sarah was a devastating blow for Poe, but at least he had plenty of distractions to take his mind off of it. He was studying at the University of Virginia. Poe lost his first love, but he found another while away at school: gambling. Pretty soon, he was in deep to all sorts of shady characters. As you can imagine, this didn't exactly impress his foster father, who happened to be paying for Poe's education. The relationship had always been somewhat strained, but as Poe became more and more of a hot mess, his foster father started running out of patience. If you listen to Poe, he was the victim here. He claimed that Allan had him on a threadbare shoestring, and he didn't have enough money to pay for classes, textbooks, and a room. Of course, he neglected to mention all the money he'd lost on all-night gambling binges. Against his better judgment, Allan ended up sending Poe more money, which Poe used to get even further into debt. After a year of drinking, gambling, and very little schoolwork, Poe decided university just wasn't for him. He dropped out, but his constant begging for money had burned his bridge with the Allans. That, combined with the fact that he learned Sarah Royster had married another man, Poe knew he couldn't return to Richmond. Poe decided to head back to his birthplace. In April of 1827, Poe set out to make a life for himself in Boston. He took whatever odd jobs he could find, working as a clerk, writing for newspapers, or whatever else would make ends meet. But as you'll learn, Poe wasn't great at holding down a job. Quickly, he found himself struggling, and he started to get desperate. Boston didn't work out exactly as Poe planned, and soon enough, he was completely out of money. With no other options, he enlisted in the army. Well, not exactly. Edgar A. Perry enlisted. Why the name change? Well, Poe's application wasn't quite on the level. There was just one problem with Poe's plan to join the army and make something of himself. At just 18 years old, he was too young to enlist. But that wasn't about to stop someone as desperate as Poe. Edgar Allan Poe changed names as often as other people change hats, and he became the 22-year-old Edgar A. Perry. His plan worked, and he got into the army. That same year, he published his first book. Tamerlane and Other Poems was a 40-page collection of poetry, and its mysterious byline simply said, by a Bostonian. So did this punk rock poetry book set the literary world aflame and make Poe an overnight sensation? Well, Poe's triumphant literary debut was a total flop. He only managed to get 50 copies printed, and those 50 copies were basically ignored. At least he had the army to fall back on. But if we know anything about Poe by this point, it's that he wasn't the most stable guy. He got itchy feet. He suddenly wanted out. And would you believe it, he had the perfect excuse. Remember how Poe lied on his enlistment form? Lucky for him, that gave him an easy out when he wanted to leave the army. He just revealed his real name and age to his commanding officer. He was sure he was scot-free. But nothing was ever that easy for Edgar Allan Poe. His commanding officer agreed to release him on one condition. Unfortunately, that one condition was all but impossible. Poe's commanding officer told Poe he'd release him only if he made up with his foster father, John Allan. The problem was, Allan wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. Poe spent months sending letters to his Allan, begging for forgiveness. Allan ignored every single one. That was bad enough, but it was nothing compared to Allan's true betrayal. John Allan was so fed up with his foster son that he didn't even tell Poe that his wife and Poe's foster mother was on her deathbed. By the time Poe finally found out, it was too late. He made it back to Richmond the day after her burial, but at least there was a silver lining to this whole sad affair. Maybe the loss of his wife softened his cold heart, because Allan finally buried the hatchet with his troubled foster son. With Allan's support, Poe got his discharge from the army. It must have been bittersweet, but he was finally able to move on with his life. And it seems like good things came in waves for Poe, because that wasn't the only piece of good news he got around this time. Poe finally got the discharge he was looking for, but the next development was even better. The world-famous critic John Neal had read his poetry, and he liked it. A shout-out from Neal was huge in the tiny world of 19th century American literature. For the first time, Poe had a reason to believe he kinda had a knack for this writing thing. On top of all this good fortune, Poe's love life even started to look up again. Not long after he got out of the army, Poe met his 7-year-old cousin Virginia Clem. This event would completely alter the course of Poe's life. Within 6 years, Poe would make Virginia his wife. Virginia would end up being the light of Poe's life. She's also one of the darkest stains on his legacy. For all of John Allan's self-righteousness about Poe's gambling, he was no saint himself. Across both of his marriages, he had 7 affairs, some of them even bearing children. Poe started calling his foster father out, and that was what finally pushed Allan over the edge. The two of them had been at odds for nearly Poe's entire life, but this time, he'd gone too far. He disowned Poe for good. Poe headed to New York to try and finally make it as a writer. But before he could get his feet off the ground, a horrible tragedy struck at home. His elder brother was seriously ill. Poe put his ambitions on hold and returned to Baltimore to be with his brother. Henry Poe had been a drinker like his brother and had caught up with him. He died on August 1st, 1831. He was only 24 years old. After the loss of his brother, Poe decided it was time to stop making excuses and start making a living as a full-time writer. But that was easier said than done. See, 19th century American publishing was an absolute nightmare for writers. Without any international copyright law, publishers could just steal British works and publish them for free, so why pay an American? Poe would very quickly learn that his chosen profession was anything but lucrative, and it drove him to disturbing places. If you did manage to get a publisher to release your writing, you had another problem. They might just flat out not pay you. As his career started taking off, the great Edgar Allan Poe often had to resort to begging his publishers for the money they'd promised him. It was a miserable existence, and even when Poe managed any small amount of success, he usually managed to screw it up for himself. So when Poe actually landed a gig working as an editor at a literary magazine, you just know it was going to go up in flames. One of the stories Poe had managed to get published caught the attention of a wealthy patron who introduced Poe to the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. Poe got hired as an assistant editor, and it finally looked like he was getting a foothold in the literary world. But Poe's biggest obstacle was always Poe. Almost immediately, Poe's boss noticed he had a habit of coming into work loaded. Poe didn't last a month. But while his professional life was in the gutter, at least he had women to take his mind off of it. Poe moved in with his aunt, uncle, and now 11-year-old cousin, Virginia. In 1835, he got a license to marry Virginia. He was 26 years old, and she was 13. Even in 1835, marrying your 13-year-old cousin was a pretty disturbing thing to do. Again, to make it clear that this was not normal, they had to lie and claim that Virginia was 21. Despite everyone in the world thinking it was creepy, at best, and disturbing at worst, Poe had finally done it. He had married his 13-year-old cousin. But the relationship was even more twisted than it seemed. Tragedy was about to rear its ugly head once again. One night, Virginia Poe was singing and playing piano for Poe when she had a frightening episode. Poe later described it as breaking a blood vessel in her throat. Virginia had been the picture of health, so the couple likely assumed it was nothing. Sadly, it was a dark sign of things to come. Virginia never fully recovered from her attack that night. She became weak and frail, a mere shadow of her past self. Now, Poe wasn't the most together guy on the best of days, but the sight of his wife wasting away was too much for him to bear. If he liked his drink before, now it became like mother's milk to him. Poe lost himself to the bottle, and as you can imagine, it started to affect other areas of his life as well. The best way to make it in the writing world is through connections, and that wasn't exactly Poe's strong suit. He made some very powerful enemies when he publicly accused the beloved Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of plagiarism. It seemed like Poe couldn't take two steps without self-sabotaging in one way or another. When Poe's poem The Raven appeared in the Evening Mirror, it was the equivalent of a viral sensation. The poem became an instant hit, and journals all over the country clamored to publish it. Basically overnight, households all across America came to know the name Edgar Allan Poe. After decades of struggle and failure, Poe had finally arrived. But remember how I said the 19th century wasn't exactly kind to writers? Poe was about to learn that the hard way, that being a household name wasn't exactly everything. The Raven made Edgar Allan Poe a nationwide sensation, but just because he was famous, that doesn't mean he was rich. The Evening Mirror paid Poe a whopping $9 for the poem. He never saw another cent. When the poem became a hit, maybe he thought his troubles were over, but in reality, they were only beginning. Virginia didn't stop Poe from looking at other women. In fact, she might have encouraged it. That's how Poe began his tumultuous relationship with the poet Frances Sargent Osgood. To call it a mess would be an understatement. First, there was the fact that Osgood already had a husband. Next, there was Elizabeth F. Elliot, another poet who happened to be obsessed with Poe, and who utterly despised Osgood. The famously petty and vindictive Ellet seemed to be of the belief, if I can't have him, no one can. As far as anyone knew, Poe and Osgood hadn't gone any further than flirtation, but Ellet knew the relationship would cause a huge scandal. She wrote to Osgood and told her to cut off contact with Poe, along with a not-so-subtle threat to reveal their flirtations if she didn't. When Poe heard about this, he was furious. He gathered up every letter of hers in his possession and dumped them all at her house. Apparently, Ellet couldn't get enough of the drama because her response was absolutely insane. She pretended he still had the letters and sent her brother, a colonel, to collect them. When Poe couldn't produce the letters, Ellet's brother threatened to kill him, and he meant it. The threat scared Poe enough that he borrowed a pistol from a friend, just in case. Gossip rags across the country picked up the story and reprinted Ellet's accusations. Pretty soon, half of the country believed Poe was a deranged adulterer. Granted, his erratic behavior didn't exactly help matters. Poe's reputation was in tatters, but his wife took it even worse. People started sending her anonymous letters claiming her husband was having affairs. And by people, we mean almost certainly Ellet. Virginia was already frail, but the stress of the scandal eventually became too much. The end was near. Poe moved his wife to a small cottage in what is now the Bronx, in the hopes that she could recover, but he couldn't save her. Virginia succumbed to tuberculosis at the cottage on January 30th, 1847. On her deathbed, she claimed that Mrs. E had been her murderer. Whatever Poe's relationship with Virginia was, her loss left him utterly inconsolable. He couldn't even bear to look at her face at her funeral, crying that he wanted only to remember her as she was. He regularly visited her grave for the rest of his life. Even in the dead of winter, friends would sometimes find him sitting next to her tomb, nearly frozen among the snowdrifts. Edgar Allan Poe was always an emotionally fragile man, but after Virginia was gone, Poe's life was falling apart around him, and it brought him right back into the arms of his first love, Sarah Elmira Royster. It seemed like fate. They'd missed each other in their youth, but here was a second chance. At first, it was like Poe and Royster were teenagers again. They rekindled their relationship and quickly started discussing marriage. Her deceased husband's will ensured that she'd lose 3/4 of her inheritance if she remarried. Still, Poe ignored the haters and asked for her hand. Royster needed some time to think about it, but by the time she was ready to give her answer, it was too late. The last time Sarah Royster ever saw Edgar Allan Poe, he looked like a terror. He came to her house shortly before leaving for a trip to New York City. Insanely depressed and complaining of sickness, Poe was a shell of his former self. His appearance worried Royster so much that she ran to check on him the next morning, but he'd already left. Edgar Allan Poe left Richmond headed for New York on September 27, 1849. Nearly a week later, Joseph W. Walker found a tattered and delirious man in a gutter outside a tavern in Baltimore. That man was Poe, who he'd been missing that whole time. Walker pressed him for information. Poe could barely string together a sentence. The one thing he managed to get out was the name Dr. Joseph E. Snodgrass. Snodgrass was a friend who lived in Baltimore. Walker wrote to Snodgrass immediately asking for help. When the man did arrive, what he saw left him completely stunned. Snodgrass set about learning what had happened, but as he started pressing Poe, the mystery only deepened. Snodgrass couldn't get a single comprehensible word out of Poe. The man had absolutely no memory of what had happened to him. Or maybe he didn't want to remember. When his doctor tried to cheer him up by saying soon enough he'd be back hanging out with his friends, Poe grimly replied, "The best thing my friend could do would be to blow out my brains with a pistol." Poe didn't say much in those delirious days, but what he did say was utterly tragic. He kept calling out for his wife back in Richmond. He never mentioned a name, so that means one of two things. He meant Virginia and had forgotten he'd lost her, or he meant Sarah, unaware that she hadn't accepted his marriage proposal. For whatever reason, the hospital refused to allow anyone to visit Poe in his final days. Every single piece of medical documentation about Edgar Allan Poe's final days, including his death certificate, have been lost. They may have never existed at all. What happened to Poe in those grim moments, we may never know for sure. We haven't even mentioned the strangest part of Edgar Allan Poe's twisted end. As he lay dying, he kept shouting a single word: Reynolds. To this day, we still have no idea who he was talking about. Did this Reynolds have something to do with how Poe ended up in his gruesome state? This is probably one of those mysteries that will just have to remain unsolved. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.